What do you mean you're transferring everything to Azure Gardens? The Crystal Pavilion was booked months ago. My grip tightened on the phone as I stepped away from my desk, seeking refuge in the empty conference room. The engagement party was scheduled for this Saturday, invitations sent, deposits paid, dreams carefully crafted over countless late-night planning sessions. The venue was simply too ambitious, Victoria. My stepmother's voice carried that practiced calm she'd perfected over the years, the tone that always preceded disappointment. Your father and I discussed it, and we've decided to make some adjustments. Azure Gardens has a lovely private dining room that would be more appropriate. Appropriate. The word hung in the air like a verdict. I could feel my face flushing as I stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows of our downtown office building. The Crystal Pavilion had been my dream venue since I was 16, its glass-domed ceiling and panoramic city views the perfect backdrop for life's most precious moments. I'd talked about it endlessly during family dinners, back when my mother was still alive. We already put down a deposit, I countered, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. How much could you possibly be saving by canceling now? A telling pause followed. It's not just about the money, Victoria. It's about setting reasonable expectations for your future. With Nathan's background, perhaps it's better to start with something more modest. The implication was clear, and it made my stomach knot. I ended the call shortly after, promising to discuss it later while knowing the decision had already been made. My name is Victoria, 34 years old, and despite growing up in the city's most exclusive gated community, I've spent my adult life proving I could make it on my own. I built a successful career in sustainable architecture without touching my trust fund. I purchased my own penthouse without my father's connections. And I fell in love with Nathan, a brilliant software developer who grew up with nothing but made something extraordinary of himself, even if my family couldn't see beyond his modest clothes and unassuming demeanor. All I wanted was one day, one perfect celebration where my worlds could come together. Where Nathan and I could announce our engagement surrounded by the people we loved, in a place that felt special. Now my parents had taken even that away with barely a week's notice. As I walked back to my desk, my phone buzzed with a text from my half-sister Madeline. Mom just told me about Crystal Pavilion. So sorry, but silver lining, she's upgrading my birthday venue to make up for the family embarrassment. Isn't that great? I stared at the message, reading it 3 times before the meaning sank in. They hadn't cancelled because of the cost. They'd cancelled because they were embarrassed, of Nathan, of our engagement, of me. And somehow, that wasn't even the worst part. My sister's birthday was the weekend after our cancelled engagement party. Growing up in the Andrews family meant understanding that appearances mattered above all else. My father built the city's largest commercial real estate firm through connections forged on golf courses and at charity galas. My stepmother served on the boards of the most prestigious cultural institutions, ensuring our family name appeared in all the right society columns. Madeline thrived in this environment. 2 years younger than me, she embraced the family legacy, dating only men from appropriate backgrounds and pursuing a law degree not out of passion but because it was expected. She became the daughter they'd always wanted, polished, predictable, and perfectly aligned with their values. I took a different path. In college, I volunteered designing community centers in underserved neighborhoods instead of joining my stepmother's sorority. After graduation, I declined my father's offer of a corner office at Andrews Properties and joined a small innovative firm specializing in sustainable design. Each choice widened the gap between us, but I believed my parents respected me for forging my own way, even if they didn't understand it. Then I met Nathan at a tech conference where I was presenting on smart building design. Unassuming in his plain button-down shirt and worn jeans, he asked the most insightful questions about integrating technology into architectural spaces. We talked for hours afterward at a nearby coffee shop. He was brilliant, kind, and refreshingly genuine, qualities I'd found in short supply within my parents' social circle. The memory of that first meeting blurred with another, more painful one, my mother's final day. I was 16 when she collapsed at an environmental protest, her passionate commitment to fighting corporate pollution cutting her life tragically short. The last thing she told me was to never let anyone define my worth by their standards. My stepmother arrived less than a year later, armed with a new set of standards and expectations. The transition was swift and absolute. Family dinners at elite country clubs replaced our casual pizza nights, casual clothes were exchanged for designer labels, and every decision was weighed against its social impact. After 6 months of dating Nathan, I brought him home for dinner. The evening was tense, with my parents asking pointed questions about his education, a state school on scholarship, and his family, middle class, his father a high school teacher, his mother a nurse. My father barely concealed his disapproval when Nathan mentioned he still drove his college car, a 16-year-old Honda that ran perfectly well. Well, at least he's resourceful, my stepmother had whispered to me later that night, as if frugality were an exotic trait she was trying to be open-minded about. I'd chosen to believe they just needed time to see the man I saw, to appreciate his brilliant mind and generous heart rather than fixating on his bank account or pedigree. When Nathan proposed 3 months ago with a simple but meaningful ring he designed himself, my parents offered lukewarm congratulations and immediately suggested a long engagement. Marriage is a lifetime commitment, my father had said. You want to know someone completely before taking that step. What he really meant was he hoped I'd come to my senses and find someone more suitable. The Crystal Pavilion booking had been their reluctant concession, a way to maintain appearances while they waited for what they assumed would be our inevitable breakup. Now, with the engagement party just days away, they'd finally shown their true colors. My phone buzzed again, Nathan calling. I hesitated before answering, unsure how to tell him that my family had once again proved his worth meant nothing to them. But as I stared at his name on the screen, my mother's last words echoed in my mind. Maybe it was time to stop letting others define what was worthy of celebration. The final confirmation came 3 days after the cancellation when I stopped by my parents' house unannounced. I'd been avoiding their calls, needing time to process my anger before confronting them. As I pulled into the curved driveway, I noticed unfamiliar cars parked outside, my aunt's Mercedes, my father's business partner's Range Rover, and Madeline's BMW. The front door was unlocked, and the sound of cheerful voices drifted from the direction of the grand salon. I followed the noise, my heels clicking against the marble floor. The scene that greeted me stopped me dead in my tracks. My stepmother stood in the center of the room, gesturing animatedly at what appeared to be a table layout. The Crystal Pavilion has such lovely natural light, she was saying, and with the head table positioned here, overlooking the city skyline. What is this? My voice cut through the cheerful chatter. 5 heads turned toward me in surprise. My stepmother recovered first. Victoria, darling, we didn't know you were coming by. We're just finalizing some details for Madeline's birthday celebration. At the Crystal Pavilion. It wasn't a question. An uncomfortable silence fell. My aunt suddenly became very interested in her phone. My father's business partner murmured something about a call he needed to make and slipped out. Madeline, at least, had the decency to look embarrassed. I told Mom it was too soon after your situation, she said, not quite meeting my eyes, but she insisted the venue was perfect and already available. Available because you canceled my reservation. I kept my voice eerily calm despite the storm raging inside me. My father stood, straightening his golf shirt. Victoria, let's discuss this privately. Why? Everyone here already knows what happened. You canceled my engagement party claiming it was too expensive, and then booked the exact same venue for Madeline's birthday. I'd love to hear the explanation. It's not that simple, dear, my stepmother began, her society smile firmly in place. With the guest list we've cultivated for Madeline's event, the Crystal Pavilion makes perfect sense. The connections your father can foster there. And my guests weren't important enough? My celebration wasn't worth it? That's not what your mother is saying, my father interjected sharply. Look, Victoria, we've been patient with this phase of yours, the job at that small firm, the modest apartment, and now Nathan. Nathan? My voice hardened. What does my fiancé have to do with this? My parents exchanged a look I'd seen too many times before, the one that preceded some difficult truth they felt obligated to share for my own good. He's just not suitable, my stepmother finally said. Not for someone with your background. He's nice enough, but he has no ambition, no family connections. Nothing to offer except love, respect, and support? I countered. Things that actually matter? My father sighed heavily. Your fiancé isn't good enough for this family, Victoria, and deep down, you know it. We're simply trying to save you from making a mistake you'll regret. The words landed like physical blows. I'd suspected their disapproval, but hearing it stated so bluntly shocked me to my core. In that moment, surrounded by party preparations meant for my sister but not for me, I finally saw my parents clearly, their conditional love, their shallow values, their absolute certainty that they knew best. I turned to leave, but Madeline caught my arm. Vicky, wait, she pleaded, using my childhood nickname. Maybe they have a point. I mean, look at what happened with Brad. I froze. What about Brad? Madeline's eyes widened, realizing she'd said too much. My stepmother shot her a warning look, but it was too late. Mom's invited the Hendersons to my party, Madeline admitted quietly. Jonathan's family. Jonathan. Madeline's ex-boyfriend, the son of a prominent banking family whom our parents had adored. They'd been devastated when Madeline broke up with him last year to date Brad, a pharmaceutical sales rep they considered beneath her. She claims it's because his father is considering investing in Dad's new development, Madeline continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. But we both know what she's doing. And get this, she told Brad the party was cancelled due to family issues, but really, she just didn't send him an invitation. I closed my eyes, recognizing the pattern. She's doing to you what they did to me. Not exactly, Madeline countered, a bitter edge to her voice. I'm their golden child, remember? They're not canceling my party, they're just trying to control who I celebrate it with. For a moment, I thought I'd found an ally. Why don't you and Brad join us? We could have our own celebration, right under their noses. The line went quiet. I can't do that, she finally said. Dad's announcing my promotion to junior partner at the firm during the party. I've worked 3 years for this, Victoria. I can't jeopardize it, even for you. The familiar disappointment settled in my chest. So you'll let them manipulate your life as long as there's something in it for you? What about Brad? I'll make it up to him. Madeline wouldn't meet my eyes. Look, not all of us can afford to burn bridges with the family. Some of us have practical considerations. I turned to my father, who had been watching our exchange with calculated interest. And I suppose this promotion has nothing to do with the Hendersons' potential investment? His silence was answer enough. You're buying her compliance, I said, the realization hitting me like a wave. Just like you tried to buy mine with the Crystal Pavilion booking. How long were you planning to string me along before canceling? We were hoping you'd come to your senses naturally, my stepmother interjected smoothly. Really, Victoria, there's no need for dramatics. We can still arrange a lovely celebration at Azure Gardens. Stop. My voice shook. Just stop pretending this has anything to do with venues or costs or what's appropriate. This is about control. You can't stand that I've built a life that doesn't revolve around your approval. A life with a man who can't even afford a proper engagement ring, my stepmother scoffed. Who drives a car older than your relationship? Who would probably be perfectly happy having your engagement party in some downtown brewery? I thought of Nathan's carefully designed ring, of the thoughtful way he maintained his reliable old car, of his genuine excitement when I suggested the rooftop brewery as an alternative venue. Each thing they mocked was something I loved about him. You know what's ironic? I said, my voice steadying. You're so focused on what Nathan can't give me that you've completely missed what he has given me, the courage to finally see you all clearly. I walked to the door, then turned back one last time. Enjoy your perfect party, Madeline. I hope the promotion is worth the price of your soul. Outside, the summer evening was thick with humidity. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed, a text from Nathan, hey, running late at the office. Big project update. Need to show you something important when I get home. I stared at the message, wondering how to tell him what I'd discovered. How do you tell someone you love that your family sees them as nothing more than a poor investment? That they've been playing along with our engagement while actively working to sabotage it? As I drove home, my mother's voice echoed in my memory, her last conversation with me, just days before the protest that would take her life. "Remember, Victoria," she'd said, "the hardest choices are usually the right ones. Never let anyone's expectations overshadow your own truth." I thought I'd been living by those words, but had I really? I'd kept trying to bridge two worlds that were fundamentally incompatible, hoping my family would eventually see what I saw in Nathan. But maybe that had been its own form of denial. The sun was setting as I pulled into my building's parking garage, casting long shadows between the concrete pillars. Nathan's old Honda was already there, parked in its usual spot. Such a simple thing, that reliable car he refused to replace despite his growing success. My stepmother saw it as a sign of his lack of ambition. I saw it as proof of his authenticity, his refusal to pretend to be something he wasn't. The elevator ride to our floor felt endless. What would I tell him? How could I protect him from the truth of my family's disdain without lying about who they really were? But when I opened our apartment door, the scene before me drove all those thoughts from my mind. Nathan sat at our dining room table, his laptop open, surrounded by papers. His face wore an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something that looked almost like vindication. "Victoria," he said, looking up. "We need to talk." Nathan sat at our dining room table, his laptop casting a blue glow across his face in the dimming evening light. Papers were spread before him, covered in numbers and legal terms I couldn't quite make out from where I stood. "Victoria," he said, his voice uncharacteristically serious. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I've been keeping from you." My heart skipped a beat. After the confrontation with my family, I wasn't sure I could handle any more revelations. But Nathan's expression wasn't apologetic, if anything, he looked almost triumphant. "Remember that project I've been working on for the past 3 years?" he asked. "The algorithm for predictive analysis in healthcare? The one I could never talk much about?" I nodded slowly. Whenever I'd asked about it, he'd simply say it was coming along. I'd always respected his privacy around his work, assuming it was typical startup confidentiality. Nathan gestured to his laptop screen. "It's done. The development, the testing, everything. I've been in acquisition talks for the past month." I blinked, processing this news. "That's amazing, but what does that have to do with?" "Pinnacle Tech is buying my software," he interrupted, a small smile playing at his lips. "The deal closes Monday morning." "That's wonderful." I moved closer to the table. "Is it a big deal?" Nathan's laugh held no humor. "Pinnacle Tech doesn't make small acquisitions." He turned his laptop toward me, showing me the press release scheduled for Monday morning. My eyes widened as I read, "Pinnacle Tech acquires BioPredict for $200 million. $200 million? I gasped, looking up from the screen. "Nathan, this is life-changing." He acknowledged that with a nod. "That's why I've been so distracted lately. The negotiations, the legal reviews, the planning." He took my hands in his. "I wanted to tell you, but the confidentiality agreements were ironclad until the deal closed." My mind raced, connecting dots. The Crystal Pavilion meeting. Mr. Miller was there, Nathan confirmed. Pinnacle's CEO. "He recognized me, started talking to your father." "I think he assumed your father already knew who I was." Just then, my phone rang. My father's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated, then answered on speaker. "Victoria," he began, his voice unusually deferential. "Is Nathan with you? I'd very much like to speak with him about a potential opportunity." I looked at Nathan, who nodded slightly. "It's nearly midnight, Dad," I replied, my voice cool. "What opportunity could possibly be so urgent?" A pause. "Mr. Miller mentioned that Nathan's company has developed some extraordinary healthcare technology. Andrew's Properties is expanding into the medical office sector, and we'd be very interested in discussing potential collaborations." The audacity was breathtaking. Hours ago, my father couldn't be bothered to acknowledge Nathan's existence. Now, sensing a business opportunity, he was falling over himself to connect. I caught Nathan's eye, a plan forming. Actually, I said, we'd love to discuss this further. How about brunch tomorrow? Say, 11 a.m. at the Crystal Pavilion? My father readily agreed, promising to make the arrangements immediately. After hanging up, Nathan looked at me questioningly. The Crystal Pavilion? Are you sure? Absolutely, I said, my determination growing stronger. If they want to talk business with you, they can do it where our engagement party should have been. And they can face exactly who you are, not who they assumed you were. Nathan smiled, but his expression remained concerned. Victoria, I never wanted my work or money to matter in our relationship. That's why I drive an old car and wear simple clothes. I wanted to be valued for my ideas, not my bank account. And I do value you for that, I assured him. But tomorrow isn't about the money. It's about showing my parents the consequences of judging people based on appearances, and about reclaiming our dignity on our own terms. The next morning, the Crystal Pavilion looked different in daylight, less imposing, more transparent. Sunlight streamed through the glass dome, casting long rectangles of light across the polished floors. No hiding in shadows today. My parents arrived first, dressed in their Sunday best, faces carefully arranged in welcoming expressions. Madeline came too, curiosity apparently overriding her embarrassment. She'd brought Brad along, a small act of defiance I quietly appreciated. Nathan and I entered last. He wore the same simple button-down shirt and jeans he'd worn when we first met, a deliberate choice we discussed that morning. I dressed professionally but modestly. Architect Victoria, not Andrew's heiress Victoria. Nathan, wonderful to see you again, my father boomed, extending his hand with newfound enthusiasm. Mr. Miller speaks very highly of your work. Very highly indeed. Thank you for arranging this, Nathan replied politely, his demeanor unchanged from every other interaction with my parents, respectful but unimpressed by their status. We settled at the table. Mimosas and coffee appeared, and my father launched into an obviously rehearsed speech about exciting synergies and mutual opportunities. My stepmother nodded along, occasionally touching Nathan's arm to emphasize a point, the same Nathan she couldn't be bothered to speak to directly a week earlier. When my father finally paused for breath, I placed a folder on the table, a copy of the acquisition documents Nathan had shown me. Before we go further, I said calmly, I think we should be clear about what we're discussing. I opened the folder, turning it to face my parents. Nathan isn't just developing healthcare technology. He founded BioPredict, which Pinnacle Tech is acquiring tomorrow for $200 million. My father's face went pale as he scanned the document. My stepmother's smile froze, her eyes darting between Nathan and the paper. I believe, I continued, that Andrew's properties actually approached Pinnacle last year about partnering on their medical campus and were declined. Isn't that right, Dad? The silence that followed was deafening. My father cleared his throat, composure slipping for perhaps the first time in his professional life. I wasn't aware of the scale of Nathan's involvement, he admitted. This is certainly impressive. My stepmother recovered more quickly. Nathan, you should have told us. All this time we thought. She trailed off, realizing there was no acceptable way to finish that sentence. Thought what? I prompted. That he wasn't good enough because he drives an old Honda? Because he doesn't flash his wealth or connections? Madeline was staring at Nathan with new eyes. Wait, BioPredict? Brad applied for a position there last year. They're incredibly selective. Brad nodded, looking sheepish. I didn't get past the second interview. Too many qualified candidates. Nathan hires people based on their skills and character, I explained. Not their pedigree or connections. Novel concept, isn't it? The implications were sinking in. The man they'd dismissed, the engagement they'd tried to undermine, the celebrations they'd cancelled, all based on assumptions about worth that were both wrong and shallow. We obviously misjudged the situation, my father said stiffly. Perhaps we could start fresh. Host a proper engagement party for you both at the Crystal Pavilion. No expense spared, of course. I looked at Nathan, who gave me a small nod of support. That won't be necessary, I said. We're having our celebration next Saturday at Summit Brewery's rooftop. Simple, meaningful, with people who've supported us all along. Rising from my seat, I continued, I didn't come here for apologies or to change your minds about what matters. I came so you would understand what you lost with your judgment, not just a successful son-in-law, but a daughter who needed you to see beyond your own narrow definition of value. Taking Nathan's hand, I walked out of the Crystal Pavilion for the second and final time, leaving my parents to contemplate the true cost of their superficial standards. In the elevator, Madeline caught up with us. Wait, she called. I need to ask you something, Nathan. About that position Brad applied for. Are you still hiring? Nathan looked at her thoughtfully. We're always looking for talented people. But our hiring decisions are based solely on merit. Madeline nodded, tears in her eyes. I understand. And I'm sorry, Victoria. For everything. You were right about them, about all of it. It's not too late to make different choices, I told her softly. She looked at Brad, who squeezed her hand encouragingly. Maybe it's time I did. As we left the building, I caught one last glimpse of my parents through the glass walls. They sat frozen at the table, their world of carefully curated appearances and calculated connections crumbling around them. My stepmother was frantically typing on her phone, probably trying to damage control with her social circle. My father stared blankly at the acquisition documents, perhaps realizing that all his networking and maneuvering had been rendered meaningless by the very man he deemed unworthy. In the parking lot, Nathan pulled me close. Are you okay? I looked up at the Crystal Pavilion's gleaming dome, then at the man beside me, brilliant, genuine, and completely himself. You know what? For the first time in a very long time, I really am. The Summit Brewery rooftop was transformed for our engagement celebration that Saturday evening. String lights twinkled against the twilight sky, and the city skyline provided a backdrop more meaningful than any crystal dome. Our guests were a mix of Nathan's brilliant development team, my colleagues from the sustainable architecture firm, and the genuine friends who had supported our relationship from the start. As I stood at the edge of the rooftop, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt a hand slip into mine. Nathan stood beside me, still in his characteristic simple shirt and jeans, but now wearing a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with his bank account. Have you seen this? He asked, showing me his phone. It was an article in the city's premier business journal, Andrews Properties stocks plummet as major investors pull out. The subtitle was even more telling, Henderson Financial Group terminates partnership discussions. The article detailed the cascading consequences of my family's actions. Investors were fleeing, concerned about the company's outdated leadership values. The Henderson deal, the one my parents had tried to orchestrate through Madeline, had collapsed spectacularly. My father's business partner had quietly withdrawn from the firm, taking several major clients with him. I turned back to the party, where Madeline and Brad were chatting with Nathan's development team. She'd resigned from our father's firm that morning, accepting a position with an environmental law practice instead. The light in her eyes reminded me of how she used to be before our parents' expectations dimmed her spirit. Brad had started his training at BioPredict last week, earning his place through a rigorous merit-based application process. You should have seen Dad's face when I handed in my resignation, Madeline had told me earlier, a mix of pain and liberation in her voice. He actually tried to blame you and Nathan for corrupting me. That's when I knew I was making the right choice. Mr. Miller arrived, making his way through the crowd with genuine interest in everyone's ideas. His presence reminded me of the news I was waiting to share. I heard about a fascinating new project, I said to Nathan. A sustainable medical research facility. They're looking for an architect who understands both environmental design and cutting-edge technology integration. Nathan's eyes lit up. You mean Pinnacle Tech's new healthcare innovation campus? Yes. I smiled. Mr. Miller called personally. He said they need someone who can see potential where others see limitations. 1 year later, I stood in the rooftop garden of the city's newest architectural landmark, the Chen Healthcare Innovation Center. The building was my design, a perfect fusion of sustainable architecture and technological innovation. Its living walls and solar arrays were as much a part of its healing mission as the revolutionary AI systems humming within its walls. Nathan joined me at the railing, loosening his tie. We just finished our wedding ceremony in the center's atrium, surrounded by the people who had truly become our family. Mr. Miller had been there, not as a business connection but as a genuine friend and mentor. Madeline and Brad, now expecting their first child, had been our witnesses. She'd thrived in her new role, helping to protect the values our mother had died fighting for. The wedding had been everything we'd wanted: intimate, meaningful, focused on love and connection rather than show. The glass walls of the atrium had filled the space with natural light, the perfect backdrop for a celebration of not just our love, but of everything we believed in. "Your parents' reply card arrived this morning," Nathan said quietly. "A week after the ceremony." I nodded, unsurprised. They'd been trying to reconnect ever since their social and business empire had crumbled. My father had lost most of his major investors, and my stepmother had been politely asked to step down from her prestigious board positions. The last I'd heard, they were selling their mansion in the exclusive gated community where I'd grown up. Walking to the edge of the roof, I held the unopened envelope over the railing. The setting sun caught the gold edges of the paper as it fluttered down, carried away by the wind like the last remnants of my former life. I thought of my mother, wondering if she'd be proud of the choices I'd made, of the person I'd become. "Ready for the reception?" Nathan asked, offering his hand. I looked at my husband, brilliant, kind, and unapologetically himself. At the building we'd created together, a monument to seeing beyond surface appearances. At the life we'd built, rich in the things that truly mattered. "You know what?" I smiled, taking his hand. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." Above us, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Below, the city was transforming into a constellation of lights, each one representing a story, a choice, a possibility. We'd written our own story, chosen our own path, and created our own definition of success. The real victory wasn't in proving my parents wrong about Nathan's worth, it was in finally understanding that true worth had never been about proving anything to anyone but ourselves. And that was worth more than all the crystal pavilions in the world.